Really good to find someone. Thanks, Ella. It'd be great to find someone from Australia on here. I'm really hoping there's someone other than me and Tara. Any volunteers from anyone in Australia just to introduce themselves? Don't make it look like there's none. I'm just going to assume Australians are really shy.
I'm sure they are, because there was at least half, I think Ella was saying that there's at least, half of the people here that are Australians as well. So shall we begin? But yeah, Lance, would you like to give the intro? But before that, should we get Ella to say hello to everyone?
Yes, definitely.
Sure. Kia ora everyone. Yeah, my name's Ella and I'm a research analyst here at the Auckland Bioengineering Institute, so part of the University of Auckland, and I support the BioBridge with Diana and Lance. Yeah, thank you all for coming today.
Yeah, thanks, Ella. So welcome everybody. So again, I'm Lance Chair, those who just joined from the Liverpool Innovation Precinct, and a bit of background to this series of workshops. The initiative of the Australia-New Zealand BioBridge, which is an agreement between the Consortium for Medical Device Technologies in New Zealand and the Liverpool Innovation Precinct, which covers, I think, on that agreement, about 13 organisations of universities, research institutes, health organisations. And at a high level, our goal was, when Di and I started talking about this, was really to do the things we need to do to advance medtech in our two countries as a collective. And one of the key things we wanted to do was help people collaborate. And so these workshops were one of the ways that we could do that. Started in the middle of COVID, and some being virtual, although in bringing two countries together, we probably couldn't do that in a low-cost way other than virtually. And so across a number of themes and in an early conversation, we identified this as the fifth one in the series of different topics. And wherever possible, if we can make connections between people working or researching in a common area, and if we can help those lead to collaborative work, then that's one of the really big goals and outcomes that Di and I are looking for in having these workshops. Apart from the education, apart from getting people or allowing people to have this platform to talk about their work, to be able to help those collaborations happen either within country or cross country, is a really big goal of ours and important to these workshops. Thank you everyone for joining from my side. I'm really looking forward to the three presentations that we have today, and in particular the panel session at the end. So Di, if you wanted to add to what I've said, or I'm sure I've got some gaps in there that you can fill in.
Oh, no, I think you gave a really good intro. Thank you. I thought I'd just do some housekeeping. So maybe we could keep our mics off unless you're speaking. And if you raise your hands, if you want to ask a question later, what we'll do is that we'll go through the panel speakers, and maybe after each of you, we'll just give a pause of 1 or 2 questions at most, and then we'll carry on. And then we'll have more of a Q&A towards the end. If you are not wanting to actually ask your question in person, just pop it in the chat and one of us will spot it. Okay. So, I did a bit of research on how FemTech came about. And it was a term that was coined in 2016, actually, by a Danish lady whose name is Ida Tin. Not sure whether you guys know that, but I thought it was really interesting. And she's the co-founder and CEO of a women's menstruation tracking app called Clue, which is doing extremely well in the market. And I guess one of the things is that, FemTech is largely defined as technology-enabled consumer solutions addressing women's health, and it covers a huge range, not just around fertility and sexual health, etc., which is mainly the mainstay of FemTech. But it also covers other areas and other areas where women respond differently to treatment, to disease, etc. And some examples are osteoporosis and cardiovascular health. So FemTech is also an area, if you didn't know, which is growing tremendously. Maybe in Australia and New Zealand, it's actually slower to take off, but certainly in the States and Europe, it has taken off. There's about 410 FemTech startups in the last 5 years. So there's about 10 per year that's popping up. Not a heck of a lot, but it's still a nice, nice number. It's attracted 2.5 billion in funding in 2021. But unfortunately, only 3% of all digital funding goes to FemTech. So, I think we're tracking reasonably okay, but we can certainly do better. And I'm sure that, what Alice and Tara and Jenny are starting off here is just a tip of the iceberg for Australia and New Zealand. So I won't read out bios. Our first speaker is Alice Clark. She's a professor at the Auckland Bioengineering Institute and a really nice colleague to have. She leads our women's health area, and she's doing some really interesting work, which she will share with you today. Off you go, Alice.
Kia ora. My name is Alice Clark, and today I'm going to be giving really a science talk. Maybe kind of the precursor to a FemTech product, but tech nonetheless, because I'm interested in computational physiology and analysis of pregnancy health. So I thought I would start with a little bit of an introduction to what computational physiology is. It's not necessarily something that people have come across before. I work within the context of an international major project called the Physiome Project and a New Zealand-based project that links to that, the 12 Labours Project. And what we're trying to do in this work is to create virtual representations. So virtual representations of cells, tissues, organs, the whole human body that lives on a computer. So we're trying to understand how cells work, how tissue works, and how whole organs and ultimately the whole body works. But we're doing this virtually, which means that we don't have to necessarily do all the measurements in a human being or in an animal. We should have a representation of that system on a computer that acts like the real system. And why is that useful? Well, these virtual humans are able to relate measurements from different scientific disciplines. So we might work with a cell biologist who is playing around in the lab with cell cultures. We may work with a clinical scientist who's trying to take measurements on real human beings in the clinic, which are usually fairly low resolution compared to what you might be able to do in a lab. And we're able to link together measurements from those different disciplines. These virtual models also aim to test hypotheses, right? So we might think we know how biology works, but it's actually quite complicated. We're able to take hypotheses from different scientists and put them inside our virtual human, see if they actually hold up when we're talking about whole human function. And finally, a relatively emerging field, which has been very successful recently in international fields of biology, is the notion of a virtual clinical trial. What if we could design our clinical trials using these virtual human models and increase their chances of success by checking how many people we need in that trial, how much of an effect we might expect to see for a particular therapy. So I'm particularly interested in pregnancy and primarily in a condition called fetal growth restriction, or FGR. And FGR is one of the leading causes of stillbirth. It's related to preterm birth, which has lifelong consequences for a baby born from pregnancy that suffers from preterm birth, and it's also related to other major problems in obstetrics, such as preeclampsia, where the mother ends up having a very high blood pressure. It can lead to eclampsia, which is very dangerous for the mother, and also requires pretty much delivery as a cure. So again, leading to preterm birth. So what preterm fetal growth restriction is that a baby might be growing normally along a growth curve for part of a pregnancy, and then it starts to drop up that growth curve. So it's an abnormal growth, a slowing down of growth. And it's a really big problem. We don't really have a great understanding of why it occurs. And because we don't know why it occurs, it's very, very, very hard to predict which pregnancies will go on to develop the problem. And as a consequence, actually clinically, there's a failure to detect this problem in more than half of babies that are born with this problem. So babies are being born too small, and we're not knowing until they're born that they're going to be too small. And because of all of this stuff combined, it's really difficult to treat this condition. And we don't yet have an effective treatment for conditions at risk. If we could catch them at this early stage when they're still growing appropriately, perhaps we could do a better job of treating them longer term. So fetal growth restriction, and actually a lot of conditions of pregnancy, are related to what's called placental efficiency. So the placenta is a fetal organ. It sits at the end of the umbilical cord, not just a woman's organ. It's a fetal organ, so we all owned a placenta once in our life. And sometimes it doesn't grow how it should. So this means that the placenta is a complex branching structure. It's an exchange organ. It needs to get oxygen-rich blood from the mother's circulation to the surface of the placenta to then feed the fetus and allow it to grow as it should do. Sometimes it doesn't grow as it should, and that means that the fetus doesn't get enough oxygen. It doesn't grow well. Sometimes this condition is related to the uterus. So that's the maternal organ that feeds that oxygen-rich blood to the baby, to the placenta. And sometimes that doesn't adapt to pregnancy as it should. And again, the fetus doesn't get enough oxygen. And finally, sometimes it's associated with the interaction between the two, the mother and the baby. And it could be any of these things, any of these three things together, which is why it's so hard to detect and so complicated to predict in pregnancies. So within our group, we're trying to find ways to do a better job of understanding this condition and trying to improve outcomes for patients with this condition. So we combine science from a bunch of different fields. We look at anatomical studies. What is different between a normal pregnancy or a pregnancy where the baby isn't growing as well as it should? We go into the lab and look at how cells work that might be associated with changes in how the placenta and the uterus function together in pregnancy. And through that, we're able to develop new tools to analyze data on pregnancy and new ways to image the placenta clinically, or the uterus or placenta clinically. And the reason we can bring them all together is because we have this notion of a virtual pregnancy that sits on a computer and behaves like a real pregnancy would, with a placenta and a uterine blood vessel circulation that looks and acts like a real one, which we can then perturb to see what's going on in pathological pregnancies. So ultrasound is the mainstay of pregnancy clinical detection. It's quite a common thing. In the first trimester, you can look at waves of blood flow in major arteries in the uterus. And in the first trimester, they kind of go up and down, and that's quite normal. Late in pregnancy, they should be this smooth curve with no what's called a notch. And in pathological pregnancies, sometimes what happens is that you end up having a ultrasound waveform late in pregnancy that looks a lot like a first trimester waveform. And we know that this is bad, but we don't know what kind of sits in between. It's like I said before, we're missing 50% of cases of pathological pregnancies. So how can we look at this type of clinical measure better to interpret the what's going on in the pregnancy. So actually ultrasound and Doppler ultrasound, which is used primarily, is actually based on a computational virtual pregnancy interpretation of this data, but it was based on information available in the 80s when we didn't really know much about how the uterus changes in pregnancy. And basically the scientists at the time thought, well, we're measuring this waveform in the uterine artery, which feeds from the main portion of the body. And there's all of this complicated placenta there. And we're just going to say it's all lumped together as one huge lump of tissue. It either looks good or it looks bad. And the interpretation of that ultrasound actually suggested that you could detect placental dysfunction by looking at the uterus, by looking at the major blood vessels of the uterus. But these models missed a whole bunch of information about what the uterus and placenta actually looks like. There's a whole network of arteries, a complex network that makes up the uterus, and that's attached in pregnancy to this complex network that makes up the placenta. And importantly, there's actually short circuits within that network which connect arteries to veins, and that's a pressure release system, basically. And if that's there and a mother goes on a great big long run and her cardiac output increases, as a way for blood to get through her uterus without going straight to the placenta and overfeeding the baby. When we put all of the detail of that anatomy into a computational model, these connections are called anastomoses. When they don't exist, as assumed by the 1980s interpretation of ultrasound, as you increase the resistance or increase the pathology in the placenta itself, you start to go from a normal ultrasound waveform to an abnormal one with a notch that goes down and then down again as you make the placenta more sick. But if these connections exist like they do in real humans, your waveform doesn't change. So stuff can happen down here at the placenta, nothing happens in the ultrasound. So actually what we're seeing in ultrasound, these computational studies suggest, is the whole uterus. And that makes a difference because it means we can only detect problems with the whole uterus in pregnancy, not necessarily the fetal placenta that lives downstream of it. So this has kind of motivated us now to look for new technologies where we can actually look beyond that major artery of the uterus using ultrasound to identify dysfunction in the placenta. The placenta itself in fetal growth restriction is smaller than a placenta in normal pregnancy. It has fewer blood vessel branches. So these are some diagrams of the placenta, which are a very complex blood vessel system. And here on the right-hand side of my slide, you can see a real close-up view of blood vessel branching in a normal placenta and lack of blood vessel branching in a growth-restricted placenta. So in our virtual placentas, we can take data from real placentas, photographs of real placentas that are delivered from different groups, or high-resolution imaging, and even from ultrasound data in an ongoing pregnancy. And we can actually put that information into a virtual placenta, and we can simulate how changes in the blood vessel structure of the placenta reflect in both in ultrasound, but also in the distribution of blood flow to the tissue, which can actually be measured in MRI non-invasively. So we're able to think about populations. What is the difference between normal placentas and severe FGR placentas? And what could we do to detect those problems? We see a decrease in blood flow in severe FGR. We see an increase in resistance, and our models are able to predict what that would look like in ultrasound or in MRI. And we're also able to look at placentas that look funny, but actually are normal. So this is a normal placenta imaged after pregnancy, but it has this a cord insertion not near the middle, which is not normal, but it's actually, usually babies are born completely normal from these pregnancies. And what we can see here in this simulation from our virtual placenta, where blue is low blood flow and red is high blood flow, that this placenta is actually at risk because it has this patchiness in blood flow. So we're also working towards technologies where we can detect that patchiness, where there's under-perfused or areas with too little blood flow, because we think that this is actually a sign that the placenta is on the edge. Finally, I'm just going to briefly touch on new directions. So looking at the uterus itself and the electrical signals given by the uterus, because again, this is something that can be measured on the surface of the body, ultrasound obviously being the main clinical thing that is used in pregnancy, but outside of, but you can also put electrodes on the body surface, which I'm sure we'll be hearing about later. We know that we can measure electrical signals that are related to muscle contraction in the uterus, and also fetal signals. And that's important because there's millions of people in the world with a uterus, even outside of pregnancy. Endometriosis is a condition that is associated with abnormal electrophysiology of the uterus in pregnancy, which affects all of us. There's a high number of preterm births, a lot of hospitalizations associated with preterm birth. And like I said before, preterm labor affects the newborn for their lifespan. And so knowing that it's going to happen is obviously an important thing to be able to detect. So we're trying to do the same kind of things, looking at the electrophysiology and the muscle contraction of the uterus as we've tried to do with the placenta, looking at blood flow, which is important to feeding the baby. And so the aim of this work is to take data from animal studies, to take a computational virtual uterus and combine them together to, in the future, help to interpret electrical signals from the body surface that reflect the likelihood of uterine contraction. And potentially looking at fetal signals as well, because a lot of our work we've done on blood flow in the placenta might relate back to how the fetus pumps blood around its body. So we're able to measure electrical signals both on the body surface and in animals directly on the uterus. And what you see around the time of contraction is kind of a rapid bursting of electrical potential with a longer wave that reflects coordinated activity in the uterus. And we're also able to, we're starting to be able to map that kind of data into 3D space and the rat uterus, and with a view to be able to translate that a human understanding, which obviously is a function of uterine size and shape, which we're able to quantify virtually. And we're able to then take that experimental information and form computational models of how the cells function in the uterus that are going to contract, how they coordinate together into tissue function, and ultimately how they come together to a coordinated contraction of the uterus, which happens both in delivery of the fetus in pregnancy, but also in menstruation and throughout the normal cycle. And that's a whistle-stop tour through all of the areas that I'm working in. And I just want to thank all of our funders, and thank you for having me today. And a particular thank you to Jo James, who is the main physiological arm to all of the work that I do. And she really knows everything there is to know about pregnancy and how it works biologically. So thank you.
Thanks, Alice. It's always really awesome to hear your talk and your work. So question, anyone has any questions for Alice?
I've got one, Di.
Okay.
Really basic one, right back to the beginning, Alice. Thank you for that. That was like all new knowledge for me. I'm just really taken aback by your early comment that I think you said like about half of the incidents aren't even detected. That's huge. And I was just wondering why that would be. Is it just not the awareness of it to look for?
Yeah, so I think we have to qualify in some ways that it's easier to detect these problems in women who are identified as at risk, because you are looking for those things, right? So if it's happened to you before, or if smoking, kind of other environmental factors that might come into a pregnancy, you might get checked more often. But we have to remember that typically in pregnancy, you have ultrasounds at maybe 7 weeks, 12 weeks, 20 weeks. So there's a big gap between those ultrasounds.
Yeah.
And between times, actually fetal size is measured by or estimated by a tape measure over the stomach. So ultrasound is not awesome at identifying size, and tape measures over the stomach obviously are very influenced by body mass and all sorts of other factors. So one of the key issues in pregnancy is actually working out some additional non-invasive ways to monitor people who are maybe not deemed to be at risk, because those are the surprises, really.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was wondering, was there a gap? You know, it's all very, I guess, structured in the way monitoring happens, especially for a first pregnancy. It just made me think, was there a gap somewhere in what the current standard of care or monitoring would be? Or worse, that there wasn't enough awareness of it. I was just taken aback by that percentage.
I think that there's certainly an awareness of it in the clinical field. And I think it's just a time of so much change, and often that drop off comes somewhere between that 12-week scan and that 20-week scan. And I think there's a gap in the technology for sure to detect it.
Yeah, because even at 20 weeks, there's still like quite a long way to go. So you would think there would be still lots more opportunities to be able to detect it if the measurements have been taken. No, thank you for that.
I was going to say that, Alice, I mean that you've identified the gap in your research. I'm keen to see you take that out and translate that into some technology and move up to Cloud 9.
Hopefully one day, Dan.
Okay. So if there's no other questions for now, shall we move on to Tara? So Lance, would you like to do the honors?
Sorry, technical difficulty. I would love to, and I think Tara's presentation is a great one to follow on from Alice's. I will read out a bit from Tara's bio, just because she's done and doing so much. So thank you, Tara, for being part of the workshop. Tara is a medtech expert with around 20 years of industry experience. She's currently the CEO of BioBridge, female-founded, female-led early stage business developing an AI-enabled solution to transform health outcomes for mothers and their babies. I personally know Tara has a great background. She's worked for two of Australia's medtech success stories, ResMed and Nanosonics. But she also gives back, and she lectures the biomedical industry framework subject at the University of Technology, Sydney, and has educated herself across all the relevant areas: Bachelor of Engineering, Bachelor of Medical Science, and an MBA. So ticks the boxes on being able to take a tech to market. So thanks, Tara, and hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Lance, and thanks, Alice, for the previous presentation. I think it's a really good segue, and there's some really common themes from what you've described what we're doing and what we've experienced as well. For example, you know, the fact that there's significant gaps in the technology today, the fact that clinicians know there are problems and are looking for solutions, and also a parallel where you know, technologies today are looking at sort of something quite narrow, perhaps, physiologically and clinically. And if you zoom out and look more holistically, maybe not just at blood flow or not just the placenta, but flow out and zoom out and look at uterine structure and things as well, you start to get more of a picture and more of a story. And so there's definite parallels from what you've just described and discussed to our technology and our business. Thanks for that intro, Lance. So I am the CEO of BioBridge. I've been with the business for 3 years. We're quite an early stage business, although we do have 22 employees now. We've had a lot of growth this calendar year. And what we are building is a platform technology called Ollie. In fact, our founder, Sarah McDonald, well, she's just had her 4th baby, but her 2nd child was a really traumatic birth experience. And she came out of that experience deciding that no woman should go through what she went through or worse. Her 2nd child, they're both very healthy and happy now. Her 2nd child is called Ollie, and he's the namesake for our technology. So Ollie really is a platform technology. It's an AI-enabled solution. What we're looking to do is really transform health outcomes for the better for both mums and for their babies. So again, following on from some of the comments we had in the last presentation, if you are a mum giving birth today, you are monitored with exactly the same measures and technology that monitored your grandma when she gave birth to you in the 1960s. There has been no innovation in the maternal monitoring space in generations. And it's a real problem. Apart from digitization and making things wireless, there really hasn't been much. So if we rewind in history far enough to, you know, pre-devices, mums would be sort of watched and monitored by measuring maternal heart rate, 2 fingers on the wrist, by feeling uterine activity and contraction, 2 hands on the tummy, and by listening to fetal heart rate with a little, looks like a shot glass actually, but a little Pinard style device where you could listen to fetal heart rate on the tummy. Now, over time, those 3 measures, maternal heart rate, fetal heart rate, and contractions or uterine activity, have been developed into medical devices. They've been mechanized, they've been automated, they've been digitized, and they've become wireless. But that is literally all the innovation that has happened in the space. So here's a mum. The standard device that measures mums during labor is called a CTG. And this is a mum in the 1960s. This is a CTG belt around her tummy. This is where the device is recording to, and there is a paper printout here providing these 3 measures. If you have a baby today, here's this exact same belt and this exact same box with the same paper printout. This wouldn't be a problem, except that today we're seeing increasing rates of maternal mortality. I mean, if you look to the US, more mums died this year than died last year. More mums died last year than died the year before. The maternal death rate is on the rise. Poor maternal health outcomes are on the increase. And if you look to minority groups, and this is true in Australia and New Zealand as it is true in the US, some of those poor outcomes are 2, 3, and 4-fold times worse than other demographics. So we do have a problem with the system, the processes, and the technologies, and they're not serving mums and babies, and to be honest, families, which is the whole community, as well as they could and should be. I think historically, you know, women's health is thought of as a niche area and a small market and things that, you know, don't necessarily affect too many people. But the truth is that every human on this planet was born somehow. So maternal health and good maternal health affects everybody. What we are trying to do at BioBridge with Ollie, our technology, is to transform and improve maternal health outcomes and baby fetal health outcomes as well by totally reinventing how maternal monitoring has been done over time. So this is our product. This is our founder, Sarah, actually. And this is our product, Ollie, which is a wearable sensing device, essentially, and it wirelessly transmits data to our screen. Now, what we are aiming to do is to provide early warning systems for complications that haven't yet happened but are likely to happen. And to date, these complications have been invisible to clinicians until they occur. Now, when you wait for a complication to occur before you react, you're automatically in an emergency situation, you're reacting, and outcomes from mum and bub are typically going to be worse than if you could work proactively. Not only are health outcomes likely to be worse, but there's growing evidence and literature around mental health outcomes and mental health conditions, particularly for mums and for their families, in terms of not having had a say, in terms of not feeling prepared, in terms of things happening in an emergency scenario that they felt were just out of their control and out of their decision. Again, if we can provide early warning systems, mums can be part of the consultation process about their care and be part of the decision makers. So, as I said, almost all devices on the market today do a combination of three things. They measure maternal heart rate, fetal heart rate, and uterine activity or contractions. With Ollie, our wearable sensors measure a whole host more physiological signals from both mum and from baby. And what we do is take these really rich physiological signals, looking far more holistically at both mum and baby. And what we do is we fuse all of this physiological data together, and then we overlay machine learning algorithms. And essentially what we're doing is looking for really reliable combinations and patterns of physiological events that are reliable precursors for a complication that is likely to occur with mum or with bub at some point in the future. And until today, almost all of these complications really have been invisible or impossible to predict. So the first capability of Ollie, our platform technology, is a prognosis of postpartum hemorrhage, or an early warning system for postpartum hemorrhage. Postpartum hemorrhages is where mums bleed excessively after they've given birth. It is the largest cause of preventable maternal death globally. We have a mum dying every 7 minutes from postpartum hemorrhage. And the deaths are terrible and an important statistic to quote, but actually they're the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole host of terrible health outcomes and other complications and costs that sit underneath that for the mums who survive. It's an incredibly prevalent condition where we have sort of for mild postpartum hemorrhage happening in about 20% of the population, and severe postpartum hemorrhage happening in 2 or 3% of the population. That's 2 or 3 in every 100 mums suffer from a severe postpartum hemorrhage. So they're bleeding out excessively after they give birth. Now, the point is that postpartum hemorrhage is largely preventable, and the deaths from it are preventable at least. So up to 93% of all deaths, that's a death every 7 minutes, are preventable. That's nearly all of them. But today, because there's no early warning system, because we don't know which mum is likely to hemorrhage and which mum is not, clinicians watch and wait for mums to start bleeding out before they jump into action. And that's where Ollie's early warning system comes to play. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But the second capability we intend to deploy on our Ollie platform is to be looking for some a similar thing, but early warning systems for stillbirth, and being able to identify fetal demise before it occurs. As Alice presented towards the end of her presentation a minute ago, stillbirth is an extremely prevalent condition, and actually our stillbirth rates across the world have stagnated. So they're not necessarily getting worse, but they also haven't improved in many, many years. And we've got a stillbirth happening one every 16 seconds, actually. So essentially what we're doing with Ollie is providing clinicians at least 1 hour early warning before mum gives birth that she's likely to hemorrhage. Now, if we compare that to today's standard of care, it's significantly different. So when you're in labour, you've got 600 or 700 mils per minute of blood pumping through the uterus. Once you've delivered your baby and given birth, the uterus with this kind of blood flow is still, the uterus still has this sort of volume of blood flow going through it. Now, if the uterus is bleeding and mum is hemorrhaging, this kind of blood flow can leave mum in a really life-threatening condition in a matter of minutes. And that just isn't very long for clinical staff to react, to respond, to get the drugs, the devices and the treatments ready at the bedside and deployed for mum. Whereas if with Ollie, we can give at least an hour's advanced warning, that's plenty of time to administer preventative medications, to prepare drugs, supplies and devices, to prepare for blood transfusions and those sorts of things. So this early warning system really, we hope, will be life-saving and life-changing. So I've talked about Ollie being a platform technology, and for us, prognosing postpartum hemorrhage is really just the beginning. So what we have with Ollie, our wearable sensor, is essentially novel technology, a really unique viewpoint of the physiological signals from both mum and baby with really rich data, and all new combination of measures, not just the heart rates and the uterine activity of all the devices that have come before. And we actually have 15 different applications or 15 different clinical capabilities that we intend to deploy, onto our Ollie platform over time. So there's 15 new capabilities that clinicians should have and mums should be able to benefit from over time. And all of this is enabled via essentially our machine learning algorithms and these really rich data sets. So I've got a bit of a complex, a messy picture here, but I'll talk you through it. So with our Ollie sensor, it's a wearable sensor, and we monitor during pregnancy, labour and the early postnatal period. We're measuring signals from both mum and baby, but most importantly, we're looking at mum and baby as a system, because what happens to mum and what mum does influences the health of baby, and vice versa. What baby does can influence the health of mum as well. And historically, we look at mum's health and baby's health in isolation, but actually they're intrinsically connected and working as a single system during pregnancy and labour. And so it's important to look at both in combination. So each of the boxes on this graph essentially are individual clinical capabilities of our Ollie platform that we intend to deploy over time. So we've obviously got the postpartum hemorrhage prognostic that I've talked to already. A stillbirth prevention prognostic as well is next on the path. When we talk about some of the other capabilities, just as an example, we have a uterine rupture prognostic as well, so that we're working on. So uterine rupture is exactly what it sounds like. During labour, the uterus ruptures or tears. It occurs without warning, and mum and bub, when this happens today, it's rare, but mum and bub are lucky to survive. So if we could provide advanced warning that this uterus is likely to rupture, an emergency cesarean could be performed to save both mum and baby's life. Today, we have about 600 patients worth of clinical evidence. So we've been running clinical studies all here in Australia so far, although next year we're about to embark on some pivotal studies in the US as well. And those sort of 600 patients worth of data alongside animal studies that we've conducted on horses have informed the early clinical evidence for each of these capabilities so far. What we have is not just research, because research is very important. It's where everything starts. We're just, I suppose, a little bit further along the continuum where we're really thinking about commercialization and business models and reimbursement and all these sorts of things. And so for us, our business model is sort of quite a scalable one where we've got the Ollie hardware, so the wearable sensor, and that's sold almost like a piece of capital equipment. We also have single-use consumables. So these white stickers here, essentially, they're a little bit like ECG electrodes, but they are special and novel to us. But they're single-use consumables, and they're used to attach our wearable sensor onto mum's tummy. Then each of those clinical capabilities, those pink and blue and grey boxes I showed you a moment ago, are each saleable products as well, and they have sort of SaaS subscriptions attached to each one. So the financial model and the business model associated with our product is quite diverse and sustainable, and it gives us both upfront and ongoing revenue streams. And on top of that, we have all of the data that we are generating, which we can leverage on a number of levels. First of all, obviously, just on the Ollie data level, which is obvious to input into the clinical capabilities that Ollie's delivering. We'll also have, of course, hospital and patient data around rates of complications and how they've been performing and all of those sorts of things. And then if you aggregate that up even to the top level, population level data on a whole host of really rich complications and rich physiological information that to date just doesn't exist because it's impossible with today's technologies to monitor, and hence impossible to be monitoring in a really quantitative and effective way. And so we hope that alongside bringing the benefits of Ollie to market, that we are able to create a really rich ecosystem of data as well that is sort of self-fulfilling and aids additional research and additional help and improvement to mums and bubs as we move along this journey. So that is my presentation for today, but very happy to talk, answer any questions, or also talk about, there were some questions earlier around fundraising and those sorts of things that we're happy to talk about as well.
Great, thanks, Tara. Well, I haven't learned a lot of that. You've come a lot further along than when I sat down with you and Sarah, it'll be over a year ago, I think it was. So yeah, and before my question, any questions from anybody?
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. So are you going to like sell the hardware and then kind of lease the AI capability, or are you going to sell it all as a package, or like how are you kind of, yeah, doing that in terms of your stages of the business model and revenue, I guess? Yeah,
it's a great question actually. So we've got the wearable sensor is a single core technology, and once that's deployed to clinicians essentially, or once that's deployed in market, each of the software capabilities as they become available, and they will not all be available on day one because each one requires a clinical trial and a regulatory submission, etc. So as each of those become available, they become available as the individual products for sale. So the digital, or essentially the clinical benefit, will be sold via a sort of a SaaS subscription. And we're working through, to be honest, a number of different models at the moment, be it per patient fee or per month or per year type fee. In terms of deploying the single-use consumables and the capital equipment, again, actually depending on the market that we're talking about, depends, and the specific customer type, depends as to whether the sales model looks like a deployment of a piece of capital hardware and then you buy the SaaS on top, or whether essentially it's deployed into the clinic, and then actually what we do is roll into the digital subscriptions, the price is sort of covered over time with a minimum spend required, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Cool, awesome, thanks.
Maybe one more question before we move on to Jenny.
Hi, Tara. Just two questions, I guess. The first question is around who pays for this product, and my second question is then around the data you collect, obviously from mums, and their data, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, good question. So in terms of who pays, again, that depends on which market you're in largely. So we have and I can't actually speak to the New Zealand market, I'm sorry, I can talk to Australia and US with great confidence. So in Australia, the bulk of almost all births, and definitely high complex births, are all within the public system. And so they're covered by federal and state bundled payments, which are essentially sort of DRG diagnostic kind of payments. And so the pricing and payment for our product will be worked into existing sort of bundle payments. In the US, obviously, it's a far more complex system, and about half of the births are covered by sort of Medicare and Medicaid patients. So again, it's a similar bundle payment type. And then the other 50% or just over are actually private patients and paid for by insurers by and large. And so working through, again, some of the payment bundles and how they look, everything comes in payment bundles essentially, where some entity is paying for a low risk vaginal birth or a medium risk vaginal birth or a cesarean section or whatever, and each of those different procedures, for lack of a better term, is bundled into a payment where the facility needs to cover that, all the costs associated with that particular care, into a bundle. And so regardless of whether the money's coming from the government or an insurer or the person individually, that is how the payments work and the systems that we're paying into. In terms of the data, so at the moment we are not taking in patient identifying data into our OLI system, so we don't need any. We make our determinations, our diagnostics and our prognostics based solely on the physiological data that we're collecting from the signal. So we don't need to bring in age, BMI, past history and these sorts of pieces of risk information into our device. So we're purely have the sensor on and we make our own diagnostic. From there, we send the data to the electronic medical records where they are aggregated with the patient data. So in terms of patient privacy inside our device, we're not taking that particular patient identifying data in, I suppose.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. The good thing we have a panel at the end where we can start expanding on some of these, I think. But yeah, just in the interest of time, we might move on to Jenny and Jenny's presentation. But thanks, Tara. We'll come back to you at the end.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just looking for Jenny.
Right, should I just launch into it?
I'll just do a short bio. I had bits of paper all over my desk here. So yeah, Jenny's the CEO and founder of Juno Fem, if I'm saying that the right way.
No, it's fine.
A spin-out company from ABI, and where you've been led the pelvic floor research group and principal investigator in senior risk for 12 years, where the focus of your research has been pelvic floor muscle function and dysfunction. So thanks very much for joining us today, Jenny, and yeah, over to you.
Cool. So thanks very much. I hope you can see my screen. So yeah, so thanks to Di and to the BioBridge, and I'll talk to you about creating Juno Fem and FemFit, which is the medical device. I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey of translational research and perhaps a little bit about how we've got to the place that we've got to, depending on how we're doing for time. So if I'm going over, please, Ella or somebody just shout. So I'm going to give you a little bit of context as to how we've come to the place that we've come to. So as was mentioned, my background is actually clinical, but I started the pelvic floor research group at the Auckland Bioengineering Institute quite a long time ago. And the original focus of our research was really around looking at, similar to what Alice is doing, using these computational models to try and look at mechanisms of childbirth. Being a midwife as a background, I was really always keen that we weren't doing a really good job with women and we could do better. So we did spend some time on that and really looking at the effect of vaginal delivery on the muscles of the pelvic floor in particular. The research then morphed into really creating instrumentation whereby we could measure pelvic floor muscle function in a more valid way than was currently being conducted at the time. So a lot of the research that was under the umbrella of the pelvic floor research in the beginning was around childbirth, and it was, say, around these computational models. And this is just an illustration of how these can be developed. These are taking MRI images, segmenting out the relevant geometry from the anatomy, and then applying some constraints in maths that Alice is really good at, and then simulating childbirth. And you can see that the reason I've just popped this up here is you can see the enormous degree of stretch that these muscles need to go through in order to facilitate a vaginal delivery. So I've just popped this up here because I think there's quite a good understanding, clinically at least, that as we go through life, pelvic floor muscle changes. And you can imagine that if you start off with a capacity, depending on predisposing factors, your genetics or your history, as to how that muscle will function. And then as we move through life, there'll be inciting factors. And one of the real inciting factors for pelvic floor dysfunction is, of course, childbirth, which I think has just been shown. Sometimes that pelvic floor jumps back and performs exactly as we are hoping, and sometimes it doesn't. Other factors such as lifestyle, chronic conditions can actually raise or lower that symptom threshold. So when you start to develop symptoms of pelvic floor muscle dysfunction as you go through life, that can either be at an earlier age or a later age, depending on all those intervening factors. And so this is where we can make a difference, is that if we can actually encourage lifestyle factors and training for helping that pelvic floor get back to as it should be functioning. It's not always possible, but if we can, then that will be helpful so that those symptoms of dysfunction don't come in at an earlier age in life. So that brings me to pelvic floor muscle training, which is really what we're all about. And you may be familiar with this more along the lines of Kegel exercises or indeed pelvic floor muscle training. We know from the literature and we know from the evidence that pelvic floor muscle training is a very effective conservative treatment, particularly for those symptoms of dysfunction of unwanted urinary leakage. So this is any sort of uncontrolled urinary leakage, in particular stress urinary incontinence. So that's leakage when you laugh, cough, jump, or sneeze. And we know that the prevalence of this is high. 1 in 3 women will suffer at some point in their lives from incontinence. And also mild symptoms of prolapse, so that lump, dragging sensation in your vagina, all those things that happen predominantly after childbirth, but can happen any stage throughout our life course. I think what's interesting too in terms of pelvic floor muscle training is that if you typically are given instructions, or the first time you are aware of your pelvic floor is probably when you're pregnant, and you might be lucky and be told about pelvic floor exercises. And if you're luckier, you might get some sort of pamphlet that tells you you need to do your Kegels. And the instruction typically is squeeze and lift and hold. And we know that 30% of women cannot effectively contract their pelvic floor. So they might be doing their Kegels with the intent that this is going to help. But if that's not affected, or the dosage is not high enough, then that's not going to help anyway. So there's a lack of research around pelvic floor muscle training devices. There's a plethora of devices out there. If you just have to Google pelvic floor, you'll come up with hundreds of options. But there's not a lot of science and not a lot of research behind those that are valid and those that can actually make a difference. So this is kind of where we've come in. This has been a passion for a long time, and you can see this is the timeline of actually how we've moved through different iterations of trying to measure function. So we started off by just a little balloon sits at the top of the vagina and really just assesses abdominal pressure. And then as we morphed through, we developed what we've called a pressure sensor array, and we have developed some IP around this. These were very much under the umbrella of research, and it indeed did have the capacity to give us a vaginal pressure profile. So we could really distinguish now between pelvic floor muscle activation and a rise in abdominal pressure. And why that's important is because often women will say when they're contracting their pelvic floor, they're actually contracting something else. Or if they're more vulnerable through a chronic cough or weight gain, or even during pregnancy and afterwards, and those pelvic floor muscles are not working and you're actually straining rather than contracting. And so obviously then not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So moving on to closer to where we are now, 2018, we did come up with an instrument that was valid and had gone through a lot of testing, and we've done quite a lot of research around this. And we've published in various articles, and we had a prototype instrument that we could deploy, and gave us some really interesting and valid measurements. And so now what we did, this is the result of my last PhD student who was really looking at the utility of this intravaginal pressure sensing device to enhance pelvic floor muscle visibility for women, particularly with stress urinary incontinence, and whether having this biofeedback was helpful or whether just following an exercise program on an app would be sufficient. So she looked at these complete 12-week training program at home with and without biofeedback using this pressure sensor array. So we had a group with biofeedback, and then we had a group with non-biofeedback. And the outcome measures were really in terms of questionnaires, so quality of life and also symptoms of incontinence. But we looked at those changes in pressure measured by the FemFit as well. And what she found was interesting. So there was no change in those two groups between ICIQ, that's a standard questionnaire of incontinence, and also a manual method of determining the strength of those muscles. So between those two groups, there wasn't very much change. And so, but what she did find was that there was change in those pressures. And so the women who had the device got much stronger, and that gave us confidence that this pelvic floor muscle training could be delivered without a clinician or contact at home. So traditionally, when you've gone to a pelvic floor physio, you would have had to have come back. So we were quite pleased to see that both groups got better, but there was an increase in pelvic floor muscle activation pressure for our group that had the biofeedback. And so this is the point where we are now. We now have product at market. We are a company, and we are providing a solution which we hope will be the most trusted solution for women with pelvic floor issues and to improve their pelvic floor health. So the device itself is a biofeedback device. It is slim. It does provide this sensor array, but further to that, much the same as what Tara was saying, that we provide this wraparound service. So each one of these sensors collects data, collects pressure data. We collate that on our servers at a back end. We've got algorithms that can run over them, and we can tell you whether you're doing those contractions correctly or not. And we can feed back to women. We know adherence is a big problem. We know that people fall off the wagon. And so having that continual contact with JunoFem throughout that 12-week program really does enhance not just visibility of what's happening, but also that you can have someone to support you through those 12 weeks of training. So we've come a long way, and we've got what we've called 8 tiny sensors and infinite possibilities. And what our value proposition now is, so what our point of difference is that we can measure a vaginal pressure profile. So we can really tell you whether you're able to activate your pelvic floor or whether in fact that technique is incorrect. And the feedback is real-time biofeedback, and it is delivered via a mobile app on your phone. And so this is the sort of output that you'll see. So each of these little bars represents one of those sensors on the instrument. And the message is pretty simple, is to keep the pink bar higher than the gray bar. So the gray bars represent your abdominal pressure and the pink bars represent your pelvic floor muscle activation. And we've got that array of sensors, meaning we will probably always find your pelvic floor. So this is somebody using the device. You can see that for this person, the pelvic floor is situated quite close to sensors 1 and 2, but she's able to contract. We've got a little bird that flies along a path, and then it relaxes as you go through. So real-time feedback, it can track your exercise as you go through. And it gives visibility not only to the end user, but also to the clinician. So the program I mentioned before is pelvic floor muscle training is only as good as the amount that you give or the dosage. So we've based the delivery of our pelvic floor muscle training program on a validated protocol that was tested in randomized controlled trials. So we know that they work. It is 12 weeks and it actually uses all the components of exercise physiology. So we look at strength training, we look at coordination, we look at endurance. And then there's a technique called the knack, which is kind of a squeeze before you sneeze. And it is progressive over these 12 weeks. You start off doing your exercises for 8 minutes in a lying position. You move to standard supporting for 12 minutes, and then eventually more functionally standing up. And it's a 16-minute program. And it is important that it's functional. And that, again, is one of the differences between us and a lot of the other products on the market is it's a wearable. You can put it in and you actually don't really even feel it. So this is where we've come to. I'm not quite sure how I'm doing for time, but if I'm okay, I'll just move on and tell you a little bit about our journey to taking this now to being a company. So Ella, pop in if I am running over, but if not, I will keep going. Right, so this was really about growing a company. So I'm an academic. I don't have a business background, but I'm now firmly in the commercial space. So this is a very typical startup curve, and probably some of you may have seen this before. I'm sure Tara's probably familiar with this. So as a startup, everybody is very enthusiastic in the beginning. You've got this cool new technology and you think you've got a great market, and you've got everybody enthusiastic, and off you go. And then reality sets in and it becomes really clear that you are, there's a lot of hurdles in front. And so things start to go southwards, and the trough of sorrow or the valley of death is something quite common for early startups, and you tend to bounce along on the bottom for quite some time until you start to get more familiar with what is needed to actually take this technology to market and make it something that can be disseminated to a wider audience. And we're probably around product market fit at the moment. So in the beginning, when you start off with these great ideas, your first thing you've asked to do is develop a business plan. You've got to sell the vision. You've got to really talk about how your research can make a difference. In sometimes an academic situation, is it worth bringing on a commercial CEO? What are those people you need to help you? What about a governance board? Have you thought of all those issues that you need for any startup? And if you do have a governance board, and I strongly recommend you do, then who should be on the board? And the role of a governance board is to provide that strategic vision for your company, to help develop the culture of the company. They shouldn't just be a burden, and really to hold the management to account and to make sure that your company, whatever stage it is always legal. So important to have. If you're developing a medical device, any medical device, you're going to need one of these. This is a quality management system, and you'll need expertise to help you develop it. And this is an interesting and terrifying space to be in, because it means that everything you do has to have some degree of verification. Any little change you make, any little suggestion you do, if you've got a product that's in lockdown and you are now iterating on it, you have to justify every single little change you do in order for you to become a medical device. So within this quality management system, you then get the ability to apply for regulatory approvals. So regulatory approvals, depending on what class of medical device you are trying to take to market, the higher the class, the higher the risk. And then there are different classifications for different geographical areas, as well as different regulatory bodies. So whether you are going through the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, whether you're going through the UKCA mark in the UK, whether you're going for the FDA in the States, it's a whole different set of requirements that are needed. And you should need to be aware it's not just that you have to comply, but it's expensive. It takes time and it takes expertise. So I guess just where we're at now, so we started in about 2019, we kind of became a company. We also pretty new at the game. We've set up our quality management systems. We've now got our TGA approval. We've got our UKCA mark. We've got our IP. That's another very important component of any company. And many of our patents are now granted. And I guess our FDA submission is about 2 months away. We have done a lot of testing, both from a commercial perspective, but also I think our research holds us in good stead. The next steps for us as a company, which I'm sure Tara will be much in the same boat, is testing these channels to market. Somebody's got to buy your product. So be that hospital system or be that a consumer at the end of the line, you've got to show to your investors that someone is willing to pay for this and that it's scalable and that market will be there in time. And of course, investors love recurring revenue. So that's something like a SaaS kind of model, not just a piece of hardware with some software behind it. So we're there. We have a presence in Australia, we have a presence in the UK, and we have a presence in New Zealand. So we're kind of well on our way, I think. And just some take-home messages. If you are thinking of commercializing your your research, it takes a very long time to raise capital. And in today's climate, it probably takes longer than a very long time. I think the key thing for any startup is to try and de-risk whatever it is you're doing as much as possible. You really need good advisors to help you to get all those ducks in a row so that you can go to potential investors and say, look, this is what I have. And then again, as a founder or a co-founder, you need a lot of tenacity and a lot of belief that you can actually pull this off. But it's worth it. It really is worth it. And it's taking your research and making it available to the public is probably scarier than putting it into journals. So those are some references, and I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Look, we'll take a couple of questions specifically to Jenny, given she just presented, and I think we'll roll into the panel just to get as much discussion as we can. Things like any questions specifically for Jenny?
Yeah, I've got one.
Yeah, Di?
Jenny, thanks for that. And it's wonderful to see the progression of your talks over the last few years. So my question is, what was the tipping point that made you switch from being a researcher to a reluctant CEO to one that has now actually embraced the role? Because I've seen you through all the stages, right?
I know. Yeah, it's interesting. So yes, truthfully, I was a very reluctant CEO. 18 months ago, I really didn't want this job. And I think the switch came when you start trialing your product in women and you see the great difference it makes. Like, we always believed in the product. I've always believed in the product. I knew that it was a great instrument. It was a great instrument for research, but it was a great instrument for women as well. But when you start getting that feedback from your consumers, people who are now paying for it, from your clinicians who are saying, I think this is the missing link. It's a huge motivator to be able to try and get this more widely available, to try and get it to a place where it's readily accessible for those that we know really need it. So I guess that was the motivating, and I absolutely acknowledge now that to get it out to the masses, we need to have a successful business. So to have a successful business, you need to be able to show that you can grow and investors believe in you. That's the world we live in. So yeah, that was the kind of tipping point. And yeah, I know lots more acronyms now, Di. I can walk the talk.
Good on you, Judy. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Look, I think we'll open up to everybody to ask any of our speakers questions. And I have to ask mine now because I'm getting really angry sitting here thinking about it. To Tara, like in the since we started this session, based on your statistics, 11, almost 12 women just died, 93% of them for the same reason. If we sat here and we went out and said, look, there's this virus and every 7 minutes someone's going to die from it, we kind of know what response government and everyone would give to that. Why are you not surrounded by a whole bunch of people with bags of money saying, get this thing done?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of reasons. It's a really complex thing to unpack. First of all, most of the women dying are dying in low and middle income countries and not developed nations. And investment capital for these kinds of things comes from developed nations. Secondly, sadly, women's and mothers' health pales in a societal context, pales in comparison to the health and the value put on baby. And what happens is that mums typically go into hospital to have a baby, and regardless of what happens in that process, most of them go home, some worse off than others, but they go home generally with a healthy baby in their arms. And society's pretty quick to, oh, look, there's mum, oh, healthy baby, beautiful, yay. And we forget about the health of mum and we ignore it. And absolutely not, I don't mean this to sound like a blame game, it's not, but I'm a mum myself. Mums are self-sacrificial. You'll do absolutely anything and you'll sacrifice yourself to the end so long as your baby's okay. And so it's innately inbuilt that I'm fine, so long as particularly when you've got a newborn in your arms. And so it's hard to speak up for yourself and your own health when you're a new mum and you're fragile and you've got the most precious thing on the planet in your hands. Following that, typically the devices and the technologies that people solve problems that they've experienced themselves, by and large. And women's representation in STEM and women's representation in leadership positions and women's representation in venture capital organizations is low. It's minute. And, you mentioned right at the beginning that, and I can't remember the exact stat, but it was that in some bucket that 3% of that capital went to women's health. Well, actually, that stat is broader. 3% of capital goes to any female-founded or female-led company. So 97 to 98% of all venture funding goes to men. And when you have a population who are by and large solving problems that affect themselves, and until a short time ago in history, by and large, what happened was mums went to hospital, gave birth, dad wasn't even in the room. If there was a problem, they didn't even see it happen. And then, so there was this invisible problem that they didn't know to solve. And so when you've got sort of such low, like all these societal factors and funding factors, and then the really bad things may be happening in nations where there just isn't the resource, even if you wanted to. There's a whole collection of problems that are exacerbating this underrepresentation and under focus on addressing women's health and women's health problems. Postpartum hemorrhage is one of them, but there's plenty.
Yeah, but we also know you're more likely to raise capital if I had an app to help me get my pizza delivered quicker than there would be for something like this as well.
I mean, medical devices are hard to get, and I can tell you I'm fundraising right now, and it's not an easy environment. Medical devices are difficult to get funded at the best of times because the average time from idea to first sale is 10 years. And when you're a venture capital organisation and you're looking for return on investment in 3 to 5 years, that's challenging, right? Like before we even start, we've broken the venture capital model. And then so there's only a small pool of investors who sort of specialize it and feel as though they appreciate the regulatory process and the risk and all of the timelines and those burdens. And then on top of that, you whittle that down to sort of like, okay, the 2 or 3% that are focused in women's health and women's led and all those sorts of things. And there's actually not that much money in that tiny little pool. You know, I'm turning over rocks. And I'm not the only one, you know.
No, you're not the only one.
I know. And you know I know that as well.
So, you know, I think it's really complex. We could sit here all day and talk about, but there's a whole host of factors, not just from, well, like this is a big problem, because that's not it. We talk about STEM, we talk about innovation, we talk about venture capital, we talk, you know, there's all sorts of things there. And I think, you know, we talk about like our first application for our product is postpartum hemorrhage. And yes, that affects mums. But if we flip what you just said, and instead of saying, I just want the audience to test their reaction to these two statements. So what was your calculation? 10 mums, is that right? 10 mums since we started talking have died because of postpartum hemorrhage. Just note your own personal reaction. And now note your own personal reaction to this. 10 babies and families have gone home without a mum since we started talking. Now, most people's reaction will be more emotive, unfortunately, to the babies without the mum than to the mums who passed away. And that's just this, it's an inherent cultural, societal norm, right? And so there's these layers of human response that are built in as well.
I get why there's silence right now. So, any other questions for any of our speakers today?
So while people are thinking, Alice, I was just wondering, with all the work that you've done, which is the first cab off the rank in terms of translation into actual, you know, into applications that can be actually used? Clinical trials?
Yeah, so there, I think the closest is actually around something that I didn't talk that much about today. I touched on kind of the ultrasound and why it doesn't work and potential ways to improve how it works. So I'm involved in a fairly large collaboration with the UK on new ultrasound technologies to look for small babies or babies that who are not yet small but are going to be small. And it turned out that technology was missing a way to standardize between different patients. So one ultrasound machine on one body is different to, you know, like a different ultrasound machine on a larger body or a smaller body. The tissue gets in the way of the attenuation. So some of our physics-based ways to do that standardization have kind of moved into real technologies and real clinical trials starting now. So yeah,
that's exciting.
CEO Alice.
Yes, soon.
Just a question for the entire group still on here. Is there anyone working in any of the spaces that either Tara or Alice or Jenny are working in? Just really interested in finding some people with some common interest to connect to. It is a shy group today. I was wondering, Tara and Alice, I'm not across the metrics and the things that you're measuring through the Ollie sensor. Is it possible this, in use through pregnancy? Because when we first met, it was like for use during labour. So I think the through pregnancy is an extension of what you and Sarah originally doing. Is it possible that some of the things you're measuring would be of value to what Alice is working on?
Yeah, look, I think we haven't spoken until today, so we more detail. But yeah, look, inherently from seeing what Alice presented today, I definitely look. I think there's our industry in this part of the world is small, and I think everyone can benefit from collaboration and diversity of thinking. And so, absolutely, Alice, Jenny, but also anyone else on this on the call today, I'd be really happy to hear from you and have a conversation, because you never know where technologies can intersect, or even sort of research ideas can spur other opportunities as well, or different ways of approaching problems. And as I discussed right at the beginning, and as is clear from both Jenny and Alice's talk, there really has been, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a really increased focus in research in women's health and FemTech and those sorts of things, which is excellent. But really, we're a really early and sort of infant stage industry. And so if we can get together and collaborate more and really accelerate that, there's so much opportunity and so much potential. And so I do think that by bringing together different approaches, different research backgrounds, different methodologies and technologies, that we can really start to make an impact and a real improvement in the lives of women, the lives of babies, and also the broader sort of community and family impact that has.
Sorry, you go, Alice.
I think I just kind of adding to that about kind of diversity of the scientific experience, or Jenny and our work seems to be linked only by the word pregnancy coming in every now and then, but we work together and we sit down together and we chat about ideas and hopefully push each of our areas along. So it's not my area of work, but it's still,
I think the area of maternal health, whatever that shape that is very undervalued, as you've said already, Tara. It's an area that typically hasn't been forefront of anything, be that research or be that investment or be that the concept of trying to get better outcomes for mothers is not front of mind when you consider things like heart disease or osteoporosis or any of those others that are receiving a lot of funding or a lot of attention. And yet, as you said, the statistics are huge for bad maternal health outcomes, as well as fetal outcomes. We just don't know. We just don't know stuff. We don't know enough stuff.
Today, we still don't know the mechanism that brings on labour. Right?
No, we don't know the mechanisms. And even in that little video, that little GIF thing I put up at the very beginning, the mechanism of labor, we don't even really know. The mechanism of labor hasn't changed since forever, because we just don't know how to figure it out. We know the beginning and we know the end, but the bits in the middle are still a bit of an enigma.
There's a lot of blind spots, and just not in there's this idea that women's health is niche and it's tiny, but just from the diversity of the three of our work, it's actually really broad, and there are lots of market segments. I was actually at at visiting FDA and the CDRH in the States about a month ago, and I visited the program for the health of women. And actually, one of their key focuses right now, I know this is a widely known stat, but one of their key focuses right now is around female representation in clinical trials, not clinical trials for women's health or maternal health, just clinical trials in general. And they've got this sort of saying internally there in their health of women program is that if the data didn't include you, then the treatment probably won't serve you. And unfortunately, most of our treatments, be it for cardiovascular disease, be it for in oncology, be it, you name an area of health that we are all consumers of, and most of that data is not from us as a group and as a population, and us being women, right? And so there's an awful lot of gaps and opportunity, and not just in these spaces that we traditionally think are women's health, being pregnancy, labor, menopause, and pelvic health, but far, far, far broader than that.
Yep. And I think even in kind of area, pre and post-menopausal responses to treatments are going to be quite different. So that's including women of all different life stages.
So I know, Di, you're thinking of what I'm thinking, so I'll let you say it.
I was going to say that, just following on from what Tara has just said, I'll just take this little minute to promote a workshop that's being held at the Auckland Bioengineering Institute on Monday, 12 o'clock New Zealand time and 10 a.m. Australian time. And it actually talks about sex differences. So why you actually do need to include women in your studies. And it talks about differences between women and men in our respiratory system, in our cardiac muscle system, in our musculoskeletal system, in osteoarthritis. So if anyone's interested, send a little note to Ella, or Ella might just post a Zoom link to you, to this workshop for you guys. Those in Auckland at the ABI, please attend in person. Otherwise, I will probably be skinned. And those who are not in Auckland, please Zoom in.
Yeah, and I thought of it because it was covering exactly what you mentioned, Tara, that we'll say exclusion or not inclusion of females in clinical trials.
And it's wonderful that you're hosting this event, and there are a number of other events and pieces of education around it. But I personally, isn't it staggering that it's 2022 and we're holding workshops on this? I mean, I just find it bewildering, but it's fantastic. It needs to be done. So I celebrate it.
Yeah, it's better to start than not. I was just thinking that the only area, not the only, but the area that's obviously missing to me at the moment, because we've got Alice and Tara and Jenny covering all the way from, childbirth all the way to post. Well, there's actually one other area that we haven't actually touched on today, and it's about maternal mental health, postnatal depression, which is a real thing, right? And it can actually onset of that could be immediately or much later. But that's actually, if we were to run this panel again, and perhaps we should during Health Tech Week in New Zealand, Tara could come over. We should have someone that can actually talk about technology for, or either technology or postpartum depression.
And you need to talk to Amy Dawes. You get Amy Dawes over here. She is part of ABTA, which is the Australasian Birth Trauma Association.
Okay, yeah, we should do that. I think that's a really good idea.
So yeah, often when I have given public talks, and sometimes I might talk about my own traumatic birth experience, people contact me out of the blue right after that, talking about it, because they haven't, it's not necessarily something that people even talk to their own families about. And often I have to refer them to Australia, because there's not a lot of Australian, there's not a lot in New Zealand. So that sounds awesome.
Okay, yeah, we should. We should definitely do that as part of the BioBridge part of Health Tech Week next year.
Yeah, and I know at the beginning, before we even started the session, we're talking with Tara about why female health and research is kind of so low on the ladder of activities that people work in, and trying to understand why that is. And yet, I totally get the investment financial side of it all. That kind of doesn't make sense, though, for it at a research level, though, and why it's not big as a health problem research. All of that. So I definitely think there's something we need to be doing there at the BioBridge level. If it's just raising awareness between the institutions, between even just CMDT and the LEP, just to start raising that, because I feel really guilty for not thinking about it myself, because you just get caught up in just research in general. And Tara, my story. So yeah, I think maybe, though, we can do something like that at BioBridge level.
Yeah, we certainly can. And I guess the other thing is, women, as you said earlier, Tara, you sacrifice for your child, for your family. And perhaps part of that is, we just pick ourselves up and we just carry on. And that's not necessarily right, but I think everyone here does that, especially the mothers and the wives as well, right?
Yeah, and it's been exacerbated in COVID too, because I think, there's sort of an old saying around, it takes a village and all these sorts of things. And when, particularly in COVID, when you're isolated in your home and didn't have the opportunity to be surrounded by a village, that has exacerbated mental health concerns in the broader population, but also particularly in women and in women's health, and particularly in the early postnatal period as well. So there's certain areas to look at within that topic.
Cool. So just last question from me, actually. So Jenny, your tech is in the market right now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're in the market. We've got product at market. You can buy one. Please buy one. Yeah. No, it's quite an exciting time, because it is now that period where we're launching out to the general public, and it's either through clinicians, so physiotherapists are either buying, stocking and referring their patients, or indeed using it in the clinic. We've got some opportunities with other organizations. Pharmacies are stocking it. There's another organization called Habit Health, which I think is in, or a type of Habit Health is probably in Australia as well. And they're an umbrella organization for a lot of allied health clinics. And again, it is about just raising that awareness of incontinence. It's such a taboo subject. People don't talk about it. It's normalized. It's not normal. It's common. It's not normal. You're not supposed to leak. You're supposed to have, we leak when we're babies, but not when we're older. And this is a pretty simple solution often. It's not going to cure everybody, but it is effective provided it's done correctly and for long enough.
Okay.
So
thank you, Jenny. And Tara, where's your technology at?
So we've completed a proof of concept study, a pilot study, animal studies, and we're heading into our pivotal study next calendar year. Lots of studies. And that's for the postpartum hemorrhage prognostic. So we expect to do, in top level timelines, the pivotal clinical trial in 2023, the regulatory submission in 2024, and first sales in 2025.
Cool. That's really exciting. For we'll be watching you here and rooting for you for sure.
Thank you.
And
and Tara, so you said you're raising now. How much is that for your pivotal?
Yes, if anyone's got a cool $21 million, we'd love to have you as investors.
In the back pocket.
Back pocket. So yeah, it's our third raise. We've had non-dilutive seed funding in government grants for about 4.7 million, and an early VC raise of another 4.7 million, and now we're raising this more substantial raise to get us through these pivotal studies, which are also in the US and scale operationally and commercially as well.
When do you need to have that closed off?
need. When would I like to have it quite, I think, and this is and Jenny will know this, when you're fundraising, it consumes every minute of your being. And so when you're fundraising, you're not running your business, and it's incredibly distracting. And so the quicker you can do it, the better. But as Jenny said, it takes a long time. It's not a short undertaking, and you don't get usually funding from just one entity. You're usually cobbling. I think we've done one dilutive raise. I think we've got, I can't tell you exactly, can't remember off the top of my head, but 20 odd people on our cap table. And so you're corralling 20 people around one common set of legal terms and all those sorts of things. Even when you've got them in and agreed, which takes months, the process from there can be months as well to get signatures on the dotted line and money in the bank.
Then more months until the money comes into the bank. So
that's right. So it really is an undertaking. So, but I am talking to investors at the moment. So that's where we're at.
We'll have a chat later.
That'd be great.
And Alice, aside from your ultrasound work that you're doing with the UK, what's your next step? What's your next bit of your research?
It definitely relates to what Tara was saying about the system. We would like to be considering virtual mothers and virtual fetuses, and think about how the two interact as a system, because that integrated function, I think, is how we're going to detect the problems sooner. Yeah. And that includes all the moving parts.
And does your work, Alice, feed into Peter Hunter's work? I forget the name of his big project.
Yep.
12 Labours.
The 12 Labours project. Yeah.
Okay, it does.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you and Tara should have a chat at some point, Alice. But so any other questions? If not, we should call this proceedings to a close, I'd say.
Yep.
Yeah. And can I just please, can Lance and I and Ella please thank, we really appreciate all your time, and especially you, Jenny and Tara and Alice, who have given us your time to talk to us about your journeys in your areas of work. It's been really appreciated. So we wish you all well, and thanks again.
Thanks very much.